Say we're going to record it too, but it will be available eventually. So this morning's presentation is sponsored by the Restorative Justice Ministry at Holy Trinity. Along with Ron Casaldi, I'm the co-chair of the ministry. Restorative Justice's primary focus is on healing harm of all sorts. It can be harm caused by a crime, bullying, or harm caused by social policies and differences. For the last 8 years, we have served the parish in a variety of ways, particularly listening sessions dealing with various incidents of harm. I'd ask my colleagues who are here in the ministry to stand up for a second. Now, you see them over there? And Ellen Toops isn't here because she has COVID, and Francis Coomer's in North Carolina, but we're here. Don, all right. Don McCrabb, he's selling books. He's the one who's going to be leading the book discussion between now and January, which will be on Zoom. He has flyers explaining all that. 5 years ago, our ministry chose to focus our work on the harm done to our country by the history of slavery. We've worked to honor the poor parishioners who are from the 1800s and the 1900s, who are buried in the northwest corner of Holy Rood Cemetery. We've also supported the History Committee, which has worked tirelessly to document our history and our relationship between us and our Black parishioners. Our most prominent activity has been 3 small racial healing discussion groups that have met every 2 weeks for 5 years, and we're focusing on our country's racial history and the legacy of slavery. If you are interested more about that, see Ron or me afterwards. But today we're here to listen to Father Christopher Kellerman of the Society of Jesus, discussing his book, All Oppression Shall Cease, A History of Slavery, Abolitionism, and the Catholic Church. Father Kellerman is Secretary of Justice and Ecology at the Jesuit Conference for Canada and the United States. Originally from Arlington, Texas. Hey, Father Kellerman, I forgot to ask you whether that looks fit or not. He studied at Texas Tech University, the University of Dallas, and Regis College at the University of Toronto. He served as visiting fellow and then interim director at the Jesuit Research Institute at Loyola University in New Orleans, where he engaged in education and advocacy on issues related to racial and environmental justice. Father Kellerman regularly gives talks to Catholic audiences on the history of the church and slavery, Catholic social teaching, and healing our polarized divide in the church and in the United States. When I read Father Kellerman's book, I had 2 reactions. The first was to echo what many of our discussion groups have said as we learned about the experience of slaves and their descendants in the United States. Why didn't I know about this? My second reaction was to think about the impact on Catholics and other Christians of hearing for centuries from the Pope that chattel slavery was okay. And that the Catholic Church supported, justified, and participated in the practice of chattel slavery. I wonder, how does that message, repeated for centuries, impact us today as we continue to live with the legacy of slavery in the United States? Father Kellerman, thank you very much for being with us today.
Hi, everybody. I'm again so sorry that but that's the impact of the shutdown plus some weather in Atlanta. My flight was canceled, and I also commend you for not walking out of the room as soon as you heard that it would just be on Zoom this morning. So thank you. I want to start by just mentioning that I'm not going to be talking about the 272 today at all. I devote about 2 sentences to the 272 in my book. But I'm not going to be talking about them because as important as that history is, and as moving and interesting and as closely as you all are to that history, that sale was really just a drop in the bucket, a drop in the ocean, really, of the Catholic Church's involvement with slaveholding, including the Society of Jesus's involvement with slaveholding. To show you what I mean, in the year 1760 alone, in the year 1760 alone, the Society of Jesus throughout the world owned nearly 21,000 slaves. 21,000 enslaved people were owned by the Global Society of Jesus in 1760. In Brazil and Peru, in Paraguay and France, you see all these places. And then at the very bottom there, the Maryland farms, 192. That would eventually grow to the 272 that were sold. But look at that. Look at how massively the global society was involved in slavery. So the main question that I had when I began my own research on this book was, how in the world did this happen? How did it happen that, it wasn't just the Jesuits, as you know, right? How in the world did it happen that religious orders, that priests, that bishops, that Catholic lay people owned slaves? How did that happen that we enslaved our fellow human beings? And what did the church say about it? To understand that, we've got to go all the way back. We've got to go all the way back to the ancient world. In the ancient world, slavery was widespread. We see it in the Old Testament. Abraham and Sarah are slaveholders. We see laws in the Old Testament regulating slaveholding. We have a different set of laws for Hebrews who are enslaved by other Hebrews from the set of laws for when Hebrews acquire foreign slaves. Basically, if a Hebrew owns another slave, they have to be freed after 6 years, another Hebrew slave. But if they're foreigners, they can be kept forever. In other words, they are chattel. So we have chattel slavery even in the Old Testament. Now, in the ancient world, there were different philosophical theories of why someone became a slave, why slavery existed. In the Old Testament, there isn't slavery in the Garden of Eden, but we start to see it after the fall. It's a result of sin. We see Noah curse his, we see him curse his grandson, Canaan, with slavery after his father Ham sees him drunk and naked in his tent. And so what we really see there in the Old Testament is that slavery is a punishment for sin. Aristotle had a different view. Aristotle says that people are born to be slaves by nature, that there are some people who are built in mind and body to be slaves. And for Aristotle, that is primarily non-Greeks. He says that the Greeks are meant to be masters by their strong bodies and sharp minds. And so really, both the Old Testament and Aristotle link being a slave to being a foreigner. And with Aristotle in particular, we see this built around empire, that the Greek Empire, as it expands, has sort of a natural right to enslave other people. The Roman Empire, which is going to be very important for our conversation, The Roman Empire had a different view than Aristotle. They said, no, no, no. People are not built to be slaves. Everyone by nature is free. Everyone is meant to be free by nature. However, this thing called slavery just happens. It happens in particular in wars. And so, what the Roman Empire does is it sets out three ways by which a foreigner can become enslaved to a Roman. And again, we're talking about foreigners, right? One, men, women, and children could be captured during war and sold into slavery. Two, someone could be born to an enslaved mother and they would automatically be a slave. Now, this was the case in Aristotle. It's also the case in the Old Testament, right? And that's in the Torah. It's in the laws of the Torah that someone who's born to an enslaved mother is also a slave themselves. And then in the Roman Empire, you could, let's say you were a Roman soldier going on battles overseas and you are at a foreign market. Well, you can purchase a slave there. Don't have to think too much about how it is that they became enslaved. So these are the three ways that someone can be enslaved in the Roman Empire. Notice, if you're a Roman, you can't become enslaved. And that's not just Roman citizens. It's really any free person living in the Roman Empire cannot become enslaved to another Roman. It is against the law. So slavery is permanently associated with being a foreigner in Roman law. And that is the context of slavery in the New Testament. So anytime in the New Testament that you meet a slave, they became a slave by one of those three ways. That was the law. So when a Roman centurion approaches Jesus and asks that his slave be healed, it would have been somebody, a foreigner, who was enslaved one of those three ways. When in the letters of Peter and Paul, we hear them say, slaves, obey your masters as you would obey Christ. These are the kinds of people that they're talking about. Chattel slaves who belong to free Christians. Foreign chattel slaves who belong to free Christians. That's the context that we're talking about when we talk about slavery in the New Testament. So I would just note already, there's a slight difference between modern slavery in the United States, but it's not a huge one. Now there would have been enslaved people of all different races and skin colors in the Roman Empire. So race wasn't really a defining factor at all. However, it was still associated with being foreign. If you were a slave, you were someone who was different than me. You were someone who was different than me. And again, that would have been the context in the New Testament as well. And I just want to point out that all of this that we're talking about is chattel slavery. All that chattel slavery means is that you were movable property. If you were a slave that I owned, I could sell you to a friend of mine and he could take you to his house. You were not a serf who was associated with land, and I couldn't sell you unless I sold my land. Now, this is just being a chattel slave meant that you could be sold to another person. You were perpetually a slave, and your children would become slaves as well. Now, what's going to happen in the medieval church is that, there's nothing in the Old Testament that says slavery is wrong. And it's endorsed in the Old Testament, right? It's in God's law that slavery is acceptable. And, we had Paul and Peter saying, slaves obey your masters. So we know that Christian slaveholding was already happening in the New Testament world, and it's not rebuked by any of the New Testament letters. Slaveholders, early Christian slaveholders, probably, we know that Christians met in house churches, right? Well, these houses were probably the big wealthy houses, right? And so those people owned slaves, which is why these letters to the house churches are addressing slaves. They're addressing the slaves that are in the home. And so the church continues its practice of slaveholding past the New Testament era. And to do so, the church really relies upon Roman civil law for its own understanding of slavery. Theologically speaking, slavery is defended by popes, Pope Leo the First and Pope Gregory the First, doctors of the church. They both defend slavery. Pope Gregory the Great himself is a slaveholder. He gives enslaved children and adolescents to his friends as gifts. Saint Augustine defends slavery as being a just punishment of God. Aquinas defends chattel slavery in the Summa and other places. We see our church councils, both local councils and also ecumenical councils, use slavery as a punishment. And that's actually an expansion of the use of slavery from the Roman Empire. Because remember, you wouldn't enslave one of your own citizens in Rome or in Aristotle. But when the church relies on what the church does is it expands that and allows citizens of one's own country to be sold into slavery as a punishment for breaking church law. For example, most often this was used to punish women who were sleeping with clerics, who were sleeping with clergy. They could be sold into slavery. Their children could also become enslaved as well. Ecumenical councils, however, use this to punish Christians who aided Muslim armies during the Crusades. So all of this then becomes part of canon law, the law of the church. And so it's officially sanctioned by the church that we can do this slavery thing. In Europe, throughout the medieval era, there used to be a really bad myth that slavery disappeared during medieval Europe. That is absolutely not true. Slavery continued in medieval Europe. Slaves of many nationalities and skin colors, including Africans. So in the 1300s, the 1400s, we would have had slaves in Europe. Some of them would have been white, some would have been black, some of them would have been from Eastern Europe, some of them would have been from Africa, Northern Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. But it continued. Now, you may wonder, were there ever any popes that condemned slavery at all? No, there weren't. What we do have, however, are examples of popes condemning specific occurrences of like illegal slavery, illegal enslavements. What that meant was, there were some ways, according to canon law and Roman civil law, as we mentioned, that people could become enslaved. That meant there were ways that people could become enslaved that were illegal. Excuse me. So, for example, if someone was simply kidnapped off the street and sold into slavery, that was illegal. Free Christians at times were enslaved by rival armies, and the popes condemned that. They condemned the illegal enslavement of free Christians, but they never condemned slavery itself. So it would almost be like a pope today condemning the black market, right? Condemning under the radar economic sales. Like, well, that wouldn't be condemning, buying and selling in general, just illegal buying and selling. So I just want to mention that prior to this thing that we call the African slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, for 1400 years, the Catholic Church had already approved of slaveholding in its theology, had already approved of slaveholding in its ecumenical councils, and in the universal law of the church. So when the Atlantic slave trade begins, there's very little about it that is going to be shocking or new in Catholic Europe. So in the 1440s, the Portuguese Prince Henry the Navigator, fresh off some very significant wins against Muslim armies in the Iberian Peninsula, decides to start sailing along the western Cape of Africa because he wants to get a strategic advantage against these Muslim armies and get really rich by trading. So he starts looking for trading partners in Africa. He has heard that there are Christians in Africa, and he wants to meet those Christian kings so that they will trade with him, and also that they can build alliances together against some of the Muslim armies. As he's doing this, he starts to conduct slave raids. Now, slave raiding is exactly what I said is illegal. He starts showing up to islands and kidnapping people. However, he doesn't do this that much. Why? Because when you try to kidnap people, they fight back and they kill you sometimes. And Henry's chronicler that's with him throughout these trips says, at some point we realized that just raiding people was going to be too costly for us. So we moved toward purchasing slaves, because Africa, just like Europe, also practiced slavery as the result of wars between African nations. And so there are markets in Africa in which people are selling slaves, and Henry starts to buy some. He starts to buy enslaved people. He then goes to Pope Nicholas V and asks Nicholas V for a few things. One, that the Portuguese would have the right to colonize Africa, and two, that they could continue conducting slave raids and purchasing slaves. And Nicholas V gives them a blank check and says absolutely. In his two papal bulls of 1452 and 1455, he gives the Portuguese permission to take all lands and all possessions of non-Christians. He gives the Portuguese permission to continue conducting slave raids on non-Christians in Africa. And he gives them exclusive trading rights with anyone in Africa, which included buying slaves. All of these rights are given as opposed to Spain. This is when, the popes start dividing up the world between Spanish territory and Portuguese territory. So this is really it's a political encyclical in some ways. That being said, the Pope relies upon and explicitly calls upon his apostolic authority to do this. And those permissions are going to be renewed by 3 further popes in 1456, 1481, and 1514. He makes one exception, and that is Africans who are living on the Canary Islands. Why? because the Canary Islands are colonized and evangelized by the Spanish. So in other words, it's still like about the Portuguese and the Spanish, right? Now, a quick break here. This is a slave trading fort in Ghana. I had the opportunity last year to go to a conference on the churches and the slave trade at this fort. It was built by the Portuguese, and it was built during this period that we're talking about. It was built, in fact, just to go back a slide, it was built in between the permissions of Pope Sixtus IV and Leo X. Just to give you an idea of like how real this was. And at this slave trading fort, where there are, prisons for enslaved people to be held until they are bought and sold, there's a courtyard. And in the middle of the courtyard, there is this little building. This building originally was the Catholic chapel in the middle of the slave trading fort. So just imagine what that would have been like. Going to Mass on Sunday morning while there are enslaved people dying, being tortured, in these prisons next to you. This is what the popes were allowing. And that really is the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade. In the year 1501, Spain will buy African slaves from Portugal and ship them to the New World for the first time. So this is when the slave trade becomes transatlantic. And by 1866, 12.5 million Africans will be forcibly placed on ships to Europe or the Americas. 10.7 million will survive that initial journey. The rest will die on the ships. And of course, as we saw in canon law and scripture and Roman civil law, if you're born to an enslaved woman, you are automatically considered a slave. And so there will be millions more of descendants past those 10.7 million that will be born into slavery as well. It would be really nice to say, well, look, y'all, that was the past. People thought differently back then. Nobody was against slavery. Nobody knew slavery was wrong during those times. Unfortunately, that's not true. That is not true. We have records of people who were 100% against slavery. I told you that Aristotle had his theory of natural slaves. Well, he writes in his Politics that he's describing this theory because there are some people who think that slavery is morally wrong. So in other words, Aristotle himself in the 4th century BC knew people that thought slavery was wrong. Philo tells us about two somewhat mysterious religious sects in the second century BC and 1st century AD. The Essenes, who were a Jewish group that we don't know a ton about, and then another group called the Therapeutae. Both of these, Philo tells us, rejected slavery because they believed that we were all brothers and sisters of one God, and so why would we enslave one another? Saint Gregory of Nyssa is our only church father, our only patristic theologian who rejects slavery. In the 8th and 9th century, there is an abbot named Smaragdus. This is around the time of This is around the time of Charlemagne. And he writes a letter to Charlemagne's son telling him that he needs to ban slavery in the Carolingian Empire. As you can imagine, Charlemagne's son declines to do so. And then Blessed John Duns Scotus in the 13th century. He was a contemporary of Thomas Aquinas and Bonaventure. Aquinas and Bonaventure were both defenders of slavery. Scotus was against it. He said it was monstrous that Christians would even consider participating in it. And so it's just not true to say that nobody thought slavery was wrong back then. The church just chose a different way. There were people who also protested during the Atlantic slave trade, but they chose a different tack. Obviously, people didn't enjoy being slaves. And so, what we have at the very beginnings of the Atlantic slave trade are baptized Catholic slaves who are rebelling, who are fleeing, who are protesting, who are telling their stories about how horrible this experience has been of being on these ships and of the terrible things that they're being asked to do in the Americas. And some clergy pay attention to this and they listen. And a few of them protest that the Atlantic slave trade is operating unjustly. In other words, they aren't going to, these few clergy aren't going to say that all slavery is wrong. That's already so baked into the Catholic tradition at this point that it would be heretical, practically heretical to try to argue that. So what they argue instead is that, well, the slave trade itself, the Atlantic slave trade, is operating unjustly. People are being kidnapped. These ships are in terrible conditions. The labor in the Americas is too harsh. Therefore, we need to end it. Bartolome de las Casas is one of those. At first, Las Casas is okay with the African slave trade. But when he starts to do more research into it, he comes to believe that it is a case of illegal slaveholding. He's not a full abolitionist. He just thinks, he comes to believe that this slave trade is operating unjustly. There's another Dominican named Domingo de Soto that writes the same thing in 1553. Another Dominican in 1555. He's imprisoned by the Inquisition for writing it. In 1573, a diocesan priest in Mexico named Albornoz writes against the slave trade. And we do get some early Jesuit protests against the slave trade in 1580. Two Jesuits in Bahia, Brazil, are very upset because their Jesuit community owns slaves. And they say, we must free our enslaved people. And in fact, we will not absolve anyone in the confessional who is a slaveholder. And that includes our brother Jesuits. The superior general in Rome, Father Claudio Acquaviva, sends down a visitor to Brazil to investigate the situation and decides to remove those two Jesuits from ministry. After consulting with a group of theologians who say that slavery and the slave trade is fine and that it's okay for Jesuits to own slaves. So let's talk about one of those theologians that said that the slave trade was fine. Father Luis Molina was an extremely important theologian in the 16th century, and he publishes the first lengthy theological analysis of the slave trade. He does it with complete permission of his superiors and of the church. And he says, look, it is true that there are some Africans who are simply being kidnapped. He says, but the church is okay with slavery. And frankly, some of them are being enslaved justly. Namely, those who are captured by the Portuguese in their wars are being enslaved justly. And he says, so think about it. Imagine that you arrive at a marketplace in the New World, and there's a big group of enslaved people. Well, you don't know which ones are enslaved justly and which ones aren't. And he says, so what you need to do is investigate. You should investigate. But the person is justly enslaved until you can prove that they were unjustly enslaved. So he says, who do you ask? Well, you should ask the merchant. What's the merchant going to say? Of course, the merchant's going to say, oh, yeah, these are all legal, right? I mean, because really the only person that would know if they were enslaved unjustly would be the enslaved person themselves, right? But Molina says, don't believe them because they'll lie. Now, I cannot overemphasize to you how important Molina's tract on the slave trade is going to be. His definition of slavery is going to become very, very popular. It will be used by Southern Protestant slaveholders in the 19th century. That is how important Molina's theory of slavery is going to be. So just think about today when we talk about, when we hear African Americans in our own country talk about how people tend not to believe them, that they're liars, that they're untrustworthy. Well, this was already in the theology of Jesuit theologians in the 16th century. Don't believe those slaves, they'll lie. So he's going to become extremely influential. And one of the people that he's going to influence is a minister to enslaved Africans in Cartagena, Colombia, named Alonso de Sandoval. Sandoval is a Jesuit priest. I'm picking on the Jesuits here because, I'm a Jesuit. We're a Jesuit parish. There were other religious orders at this time that were engaged in slaveholding and defending the trade, but the Jesuits had an outsized influence. We were the most prominent defenders. In 1627, Sandoval writes this highly influential book on enslaved Africans living in the Americas. In many ways, it's a really cool book. Sandoval, it's really a sociological tract, and Sandoval writes, look, they're not all just, quote, Africans. They're different peoples with their own traditions, and he writes really respectfully of them in many ways. It's really neat. But unfortunately, at one point, he decides to talk about the slave trade. And he defends it. He defends it using Molina's theology. He repeats the idea that you shouldn't believe in the slaves because they'll lie. And unlike previous theologians, including Molina, he uses explicitly racist theories to rationalize the trade. He says, perhaps these Africans are proof that Aristotle was right when he said that some people were built to be slaves. He says, well, when Noah cursed his grandson Canaan, what it seems he must have done is cursed him with slavery and blackness. And these Africans today are proof that God has cursed them into slavery, and that blackness is a proof of their curse. Obviously, these are false. You can read the Bible and see that doesn't even make sense, but this is what Sandoval applies to them. So you have this real tragedy of a minister to enslaved Africans writing about them while also introducing these racist theories to defend their enslavement. Sandoval's disciple and replacement in ministry was Peter Claver. Peter Claver promoted Sandoval's book. Peter Claver participated in the slave trade and purchased several enslaved Africans on behalf of his Jesuit community. Today, Jesuits have house jobs. They had house jobs at that time. Peter Claver's house job was the community slave master. This is what he did. He was at times violent and threatening and shaming in his slaveholding and in his position in the community of Cartagena. And, is it true that Peter Claver ministered to enslaved people? Yes, absolutely. He did go and meet the slave ships and baptize people who were sick. He ministered to enslaved people, and he became promoted because of that. But he was in no way against slavery or the slave trade. He legitimized it. He was a slaveholder himself, and he directly participated in the trade. If you read the stories of Claver, he'll talk about going to the slave ships with his assistants, who were his translators. Those were slaves that he purchased because they had a lot of languages, and they could be his translators when he was ministering. And I would just note that again, there were other slaveholders. I mean, there were other priests at the time who were condemning the slave trade. The Society of Jesus and the church punished them, but they uplifted Peter Claver. We only have a few minutes left here, I know, and we started a little late, so I'm going to kind of run quickly through the rest of these. And just say that you can read about this in the book. In the 1680s, there was this really cool movement of a couple Black Catholic confraternities from Brazil, as well as 2 Capuchin priests. These priests had been excommunicated for fighting against the slave trade. All these people kind of separately go to Rome and ask Pope Innocent the 11th to condemn the trade. He declines to do so, and the slave trade continues. And so I would just point back to this again. This is how it happened. The church was always okay with it, right? We suppressed the voices that were against slavery or against the slave trade. The Society of Jesus, St. Ignatius of Loyola allowed the Society of Jesus to engage in slave trading. Francis Xavier encouraged one of his subordinates to buy slaves for the Jesuit community. Like, this goes all the way back to the beginnings of our order. And what's going to basically happen in the 19th century is the tides will change. Pope Gregory the 16th in 1839 is going to condemn the Atlantic slave trade, but not slaveholding itself. He doesn't tell anyone they need to free their slaves. He just condemns this international trade, which, by the way, the United States already did during the presidency of Thomas Jefferson. So this encyclical did not apply to us at all. But he's going to falsely claim that the church has always been against the slave trade. In 1866, the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith will state that slaveholding is morally acceptable. And then in 1888 and 1890, Pope Leo the 13th, he is the Pope we've all been waiting for. He publishes 2 encyclicals that are fully abolitionist and that teach that slaveholding is morally evil and incompatible with Christianity. I go into these in depth in the book. It's really cool. We know that Pope Leo, before he was even elected, was already an abolitionist. He admired many Catholic abolitionists, and so it's just really neat that he was the one that finally did this. Of course, we wish it had come centuries earlier. That is a very depressing mystery, but there was still slavery in the world at this time. There's still slavery in the world today, and so we can say better late than never. Unfortunately, Leo will falsely claim that the church has also always been against slavery itself. And so really what you have here is future popes are going to repeat that. They're going to repeat that slavery was wrong, but that we were always against it. And in fact, today there are still Catholic apologists that publish books saying that the church was already always against slavery. It's a false narrative that has become so prevalent that I had to work really hard in my book to prove the opposite. And so, just to summarize, our popes authorized the beginnings of the Atlantic slave trade and did not withdraw that authorization until nearly 400 years later. The trade caused millions of deaths, stolen labor and lives, physical and sexual violence, and a long legacy of inequality. In the 19th century, papal documents rewrote the historical narrative to make it seem as if we'd always been against slavery. And of course, we have still not reckoned with this history as a church. The record has never officially been corrected.